A few years ago, I was at a ministers' meeting that was held, as they often are, in the hospitable rooms of a Catholic retreat center. And in some free time, I wandered into their library. And lo and behold, what did I find in this Catholic institution but a book about William Ellery Channing, Unitarian minister, published by a Catholic press in a series called Sources of American Spirituality. There's no small irony in finding Channing's essay in a Catholic library. It's the same irony as finding Ralph Waldo Emerson listed as a truly enlightened spirit in a Buddhist publication, which I once did. We modern Unitarians, pleased with our freedom and our open minds, tend to go looking the world over for a theology and a spiritual practice that works for us, and we are not, by and large, aware of the riches we have in our own tradition. David Robinson, literary scholar, who has specialized in Transcendentalism, the religious and social philosophy formed by Channing and others like Ralph Waldo Emerson, puts the irony this way. Like a pauper who searches for the last meal, for his next meal, never knowing of the relatives whose will would make him rich, American Unitarians lament their vague religious identity while standing upon the richest theological legacy of any American denomination. This morning, we're going to delve into this philosophy and the men and women who developed it. It will be a two-part sermon with some treats in the middle and surrounded by music by composers associated with the Transcendentalist movement. Transcendentalism is the third leg of our four-legged religious stool. The first two, Unitarianism and Universalism, we heard about last fall, and the fourth, humanism, we'll hear about next month. So, no sooner had the Unitarians settled down into a comfortable brand of Christianity in the early 19th century than a spiritual revolution occurred to upset things. That revolution was called Transcendentalism. It arose in the pre-Civil War years in New England. Transcendentalism and humanism are both distinctly American phenomena, which arose out of Unitarian churches and were then given institutional expression by those churches. The father of Transcendentalism was William Ellery Channing, who started a discussion group among Boston intellectuals, mostly Unitarian ministers. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are the best remembered of this circle, but the group also included Louisa May Alcott and her father, educators Orestes Bronstein and Horace Mann, feminist Margaret Fuller, reformer Dorothea Dix, and many others. Together, they espoused a new kind of theology, which changed our denomination and our country forever. You probably studied some Transcendentalism in school, in your American Lit class, perhaps, as the Transcendentalists were prolific writers. It would really be very hard to overestimate the effect that the Transcendentalists had on American society. Much of what we think of as the American ethos came from those early American writers and thinkers. From hitch your wagon to a star, to if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer, to the Battle Hymn of the Republic and the shot fired round the world. The Transcendentalists shaped American thought and even gave us an early taste of feminism and civil disobedience, which would so later shape our society. You could make the case that the Transcendentalists prodded the North to go to the war over slavery, that they provided the philosophical tradition which undergirded feminism, that their writings were an indirect but very important reason that the stunning places of the West were made into national parks. We could go on and on about the Transcendentalist contribution to our national life. Martin Luther King was quoting Channing when he said that the arc of history tends towards justice, a belief that Americans have held and lived proudly. But our main interest this morning is religious, how the Transcendentalists thought about life and how they practiced their faith. The Transcendentalists believed that the important knowledge in life comes from spiritual intuition, from thought, and from other interior avenues which transcend the material world. They believed that all persons were capable of this kind of intuition. They thought that that's what made us human. For the Transcendentalists, what they called the mind, and they meant by that what we would now call both mind and heart, the mind is all important. The development of this uniquely human ability to look within for truth, they called self-culture, what we'd now call self-development. And they held that out as the unique and urgent task of every human being. And they really did mean every human being. And that belief was a source not only of their horror of slavery, but their egalitarianism in everyday life. Someone once chided a theater cleaning lady for slipping into one of Emerson's lectures. "I just love listening to him talk as if we're all as good as he is," she said. Most of the Transcendentalists did not think of themselves as Christians. They revered Jesus as a person who did look within and found new inspiration rather than to the established faith of his childhood. And they felt that he was one of the world's great sages. But the part of Christianity that insists that it's the one and only way did not sit well with them. Nor did they believe that the Bible was the last revelation of the divine to humanity. They believed that the human quest for truth would always bring new truth to light. They were the first Americans to study the sacred texts of the East and developed distinctive spiritual practices to give themselves space to be open to new truth and to new light. They found Christianity too small. For a while, this was a wildly popular theology in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson, after he left the Unitarian ministry, supported himself by lecturing to large and diverse audiences all over the nation. Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister so radical that not even the other Unitarian ministers wanted to talk to him, rented the largest hall in Boston, the still standing Faneuil Hall, and preached regularly to several thousand Bostonians, a huge congregation for that day. He shocked all of Boston by declaring that if it were discovered that Jesus had never lived at all, it would make no difference, because the truths promulgated in his name were themselves so beautiful and so obviously true. Parker strove to distinguish the transient from the permanent in religion. Most theologies, creeds, and religious theories, he believed, were transient. The permanent were love to God and love to humanity. The rest, he thought, didn't really matter much at all. Well, the liberal Christian Unitarians were just as shocked as their neighbors by Parker. They gathered the Brotherhood of Ministers and came very close to making up a creed to exclude Parker and his followers from the Unitarian circle. After a good deal of debate, they came to their senses and honored the creedless tradition that makes us, even today, who we are. Transcendentalists took very seriously the idea that there was worth and dignity in every human being. As far as Parker was concerned, what that chiefly meant was that slavery was an abomination. Therefore, in the 1840s and 50s, he worked tirelessly for the cause of abolition. Although others laid the groundwork for Unitarian involvement in social issues, it was Parker who was our first real doer in that area. He was particularly incensed by the fugitive slave law, and he, with Unitarian writer Henry David Thoreau, became advocates of civil disobedience in the cause of helping fugitive slaves to freedom. Just as the Transcendentalists placed religious intuition above written scripture, so they placed moral intuition above written law. In the mid-19th century, spurred by Transcendentalism, many Unitarians dropped much of the specifically Christian language of the early Unitarian churches and adopted a kind of general theism, a belief that God could be known in many ways, not just through the teachings of Jesus. This God was personal for some folks, but pretty abstract for many, a sort of higher power in the universe. Emerson spoke of God, but he also liked the term the oversoul for divinity. This theology is sometimes called theism. What's critical to remember about the philosophy of Transcendentalism is that it addressed how we know and understand religious truth, not what those truths are. How we know is by our own thoughtful and open-hearted thinking, feeling, and reasoning, something every human individual who takes his or her spiritual life or inner life seriously is capable of doing. The Transcendentalists believed that the nature of reality was such that we could understand it, intuit it, grasp it, and form our own beliefs about it. They didn't weigh in on what the specifics of those beliefs could be. That's why Transcendentalism is sometimes thought of as a philosophy, not a theology. Not all Unitarians were happy with this direction our faith was going. They liked the more specifically liberal Christian emphasis of the 18th and early 19th century Unitarians. But the tides of change were moving, and many Unitarians embraced these new ideas, and the worship styles and teachings and programs of their congregations morphed to serve them. Many congregations continued to emphasize liberal Christianity. A few still do to this day. The Transcendentalist controversy in our movement, which had its very bitter moments, helped us to see where our ideals might lead to a truly theologically pluralistic denomination. Now, Kathleen is going to read to you a selection from one of Emerson's most theological essays. And then we will turn to the question of how one might practice Transcendentalism, starting with a story for children about Henry David Thoreau's practice of work.
So these words are a short excerpt from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, The Oversoul. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. As there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease, and God, the cause, begins. I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. So Christine will now turn to the practice of Transcendentalism, how Transcendentalists would live out that philosophy in their own lives. We'll start on the light, but very accurate side with a story about Henry David Thoreau's Transcendentalist way of working. Henry's work.
Henry Works by D.B. Johnson. This is the path that Henry is going to take today as we walk with him to work. It is a misty, mizzling morning. Henry steps out the door and sniffs the air. It is a perfect day to walk to work. Henry stops beside the pond to dig comfrey root. Channing walks by. Henry, he says, you're not doing anything today. Come fishing with me. Not today, says Henry. I'm walking to work. Henry puts the comfrey root in his hat and walks down the path. From the top of a hill, Henry sees clouds far away. It has been a dry summer, but he knows it will rain today. The rain will not come until afternoon, so Henry fills his cup with water and sprinkles it on the milkweed flowers. Hosmer meets him on the path. Are you being a rain cloud today, Henry? He asks. I'm walking to work, Henry says. At the brook, Henry cuts a pole from a pine branch. With it, he pushes 3 crossing stones into place. He puts the pine needles in his hat with the comfrey root. Henry tramps a trail across Hosmer's field and finds a fox's den. Mrs. Hosmer is sitting at her front window. Henry calls to her. "Keep your chickens inside tonight. There's a fox around," he says. He leaves a branch of sweet-smelling pine on her window ledge. In town, Henry meets the postmaster. "Henry," he says, "I can't walk on my sore foot. Since you're not working, can you take this letter to Emerson?" "I'm walking to work right now," Henry says, "but I'll take it to him on my way." Henry takes the comfrey root out of his hat and gives it to the postmaster. It will make his foot feel better. Henry finds Emerson in the garden and gives him the letter. Emerson says, "The woodchucks are eating everything in my garden, Henry." "I can take care of the woodchucks," says Henry. "I'll bring them out to the country on my way to work." Henry plays his flute, and the woodchucks run to him. He tucks one in each pocket and walks off through the woods. In Alcott's field, where Henry sets the woodchucks free, he finds a patch of wild strawberries. He digs up some of the plants and puts them in his hat. Mrs. Alcott is hanging shirts to dry in the yard. "You'll have to bring those shirts in soon," Henry tells her. "It's going to rain in an hour." Henry walks along the road to Hawthorne's house. Inside the fence, the garden is growing wild with grapes and raspberries. Henry takes the strawberry plants out of his hat and finds a perfect place for them in Mrs. Hawthorne's garden. It starts to rain. Henry walks in the mill brook, measuring the shallow water as he goes. Soon he meets old Flint sitting on the bank. "Are you taking a bath, Henry?" asks Flint. "No," says Henry. "I'm just walking to work." Henry climbs out of the brook and into the middle of a big huckleberry bush. He crawls under it to cut away the tangles and picks berries until his pockets are full. Henry marks a path from the road to the huckleberry bush. As Henry walks down the path to his cabin, he meets Channing, carrying his fishing pole. He shows Henry the fish he has caught. "Did you go to work, Henry?" he asks. "I'm just getting to work now," says Henry. "What is your work?" Channing asks. "It's writing," says Henry. "I'm writing a book." Henry turns toward his cabin. All day he's taken care of things in the woods and in town. Now he is back where he started. Inside he lights a fire. He hangs up his hat and coat. Then Henry sits at his desk to begin his book. Today he writes, "I took a walk in the woods." The Henry in this story is Henry David Thoreau, who was a real-life writer who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, more than 150 years ago. He's well known, and his most famous work is probably Walden. I encourage you to read it and any of his other works if you can.
The second part of the sermon will address how Transcendentalism is actually practiced. So what did the Transcendentalists do to develop their spiritual lives, to engage in self-culture, as they called it, encouraging themselves and each other to grow in love and spirit, wisdom and understanding, which they believed should be at the center of a human life? Well, they did many things, but I've picked out 3 to talk about this morning. The first is the Transcendentalists thought about the meaning of life. And in that thinking, they were not afraid to redefine theological words like God, divinity, deity, and spirit to suit their developing theology. Secondly, the Transcendentalists recommended a set of spiritual disciplines which we can claim as ours: contemplation of nature, wide reading, journal writing, and spiritual conversation. And thirdly, the Transcendentalists believed that their faith must issue in action, and so they understood that action to be a part of their religious life. If some of these things sound familiar to you, well, we're Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists were not afraid to redefine words like God and divine. Most of the Transcendentalists believed in an abstract God, not a person in the Christian sense. Their God was the spirit at the heart of things that animates the world, giving energy to all life and giving creation a purpose and a direction. Bronson Alcott described God as that power which pulsates in all life, animates and builds all organizations, present alike at the outskirts and the center of the universe, whose center and circumference are one, uncontained, yet containing all things in the unbroken synthesis of its being. One thing the Transcendentalists weren't was terse. This God, this divine, does not bear much relationship to the guy-in-the-sky sort of God that the Transcendentalists, like many of us, had learned about as children. This did not bother them in the least. They went on using these words, defining them in ways that were useful to them. They wrote and acted as if this redefining was the most natural thing in the world, and the fact that they were criticized and misunderstood did not stop them. Emerson commented, "Is it so bad to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood." We modern-day UUs, atheists, pagans, agnostics, and other varieties of folks who don't believe in the God of our childhoods or the prayers that our parents could have prayed, should take courage from our forebears, the Transcendentalists, who were not afraid to be misunderstood and who creatively and courageously redefined religious words to suit their growing beliefs. We should too, because without words, we can't really converse with each other. Secondly, the Transcendentalists recommended and practiced a set of spiritual disciplines which are our unique heritage and contribution to the religious world. UUs who would like to develop a spiritual practice don't need to go to the Buddhists or the Native Americans, although of course they may. We have our own brand. First of all, the Transcendentalists looked to experiences in nature to open their spirituality. Henry David Thoreau went into the woods to live deliberately, as he said, away from a distracting society, in a place where he could be out of doors and in nature. Emerson went out into nature to reconsider his life, as you read in the meditation, away from the usual modes of living. Getting away gives spaces for our inspiration and for new ways of thinking. Emerson wrote, "Get the soul out of bed, out of her deep habitual sleep, out into God's universe, to a perception of its beauty." I would say the same to you and to me. So what about you? Have you been up to the hills or into the woods lately? Is there a bird feeder in your yard? Do you have a place from which you can see the clouds or the fish pond or the old tree? And do you sit there sometimes and just watch? The Transcendentalist wisdom is that no matter how hard it is to get out into nature, we have to make that time for the good of our souls. Now, I know this is preaching to the converted in this crowd. In last week's discussion about the diversity of the theologies among us, 100% of those attending listed getting out into nature as one of their spiritual practices. So more power to you all. The Transcendentalists also practiced 3 related disciplines of spiritual reading, individual journaling, and conversation. The reading gave them new knowledge to grapple with and fresh food for their contemplation. They were among the first Americans to read about Buddhism and Hinduism, among other things. They were readers of poetry, philosophy, and devotional literature. The Transcendentalists teach us that we deepen our faith by exposing ourselves to new information and new voices. Just reading is not enough, they thought, though. We also must make that new information our own. The Transcendentalists did this by journaling and by conversation. Journaling is the grappling of choice for introverts, conversation the grappling of choice for extroverts, but both methods are good for many people. Do you think of your journaling as a spiritual practice? It can be. So can your conversations, if you dare to really bring yourself and your beliefs to the table. Our churches and fellowships specialize in helping people organize to converse about their faith and values in safe ways. Finally, the Transcendentalists believe, as Martin Luther King later said, that a religion that ends with the individual ends. Their belief about human individuals led them to not only honor the individual search for truth and meaning, it led them to work for social institutions and conditions which furthered that work and dignity. It is not enough to think lofty thoughts or have interesting conversations. Religion must be expressed. So what are you doing to express or further your values? That's all spiritual work as well. If these ideas and practices resonate with you, then maybe you're a Transcendentalist, following your own different drummer in this thoroughly American way of being faithful. If you'll believe that you're responsible for growing your own soul, and do it by exposing yourself to new information and ways of thinking, grappling with what you find in private and in conversation, and if you live your values in your life, you're following a rich and fruitful path of the Transcendentalists. We have met them, and they are us.